Okay, good morning, everybody. However, we have 20 people. They're supposed to have 50. I hope they show up. They're going to miss out on part of the show. Good morning, everybody. I hope you've been enjoying the days of learning this week. And today, our last, what do they say? They say the best for last. Last but not least, Joella Clamen, a friend, a longtime friend, actually, right? We go back a while. And we're all both tour guides, and she's a very excellent tour guide at Eastern State Penn. You still do that?
I've actually, since then, I've been at the Museum of the American Revolution as well.
Well, there's a plug for there.
Exactly, yes.
Oh, go
and
to
they're open.
Fabulous museum, fabulous museum. I'll have to come and take your tour there. So we're going to be learning about the Jews of Penn's City around the time of the founding of Philadelphia, before and after the big revolution. And personally, I hope she's going to touch on the, she mentioned kosher meat. I hope she's going to touch on Jews selling kosher meat to the Lenni Lenape Indians. I think that would definitely be an interesting topic to learn about. And I want to thank Jill Ivy for being our wonderful tech angel, and certainly want to thank Joella for volunteering to do this. She's going to be doing a slide presentation, and that might be the one and only slideshow this week, because I don't think I saw the rest if there were any others. So at this point I'm going to just turn it over to Jill, and she's going to explain how all the tech will work as far as asking questions. So take it away, Jill.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. My name is Jill Ivy. I am your tech angel today, which just basically means I'm going to be here to help everything run as smoothly as possible. So just a couple of things to note. First of all, this session is being recorded. It's really just going to be recording because we're using the spotlight feature. It's really just going to be recording the person who's speaking. But if you want to make sure that there's no chance that you're going to be recorded, go ahead and turn your cameras off now. Also just wanted to let you know we're using an AI live transcript, the closed captioning down at the bottom. So you can turn that on by clicking the little button that says CC. I will warn you that if there is any Hebrew used, for example, in a moment when we do our prayer for learning, it does not transcribe Hebrew very well. So we get some fun words that pop up in there. But otherwise, it's a pretty good proxy if you're having any trouble hearing or understanding the moderators. I also just wanted to let you know, because there are so many people signed up for this event, we are going to be taking questions in the chat rather than having people speak up and raise their hand. So if anybody has questions, please go ahead and pop them into the chat. I will keep an eye on it. Joella will keep an eye on it. Jerry, I'm sure, will also be keeping an eye on it. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. Also, as a reminder, when the session is officially over, there is a 15-minute chance for us to continue the conversation or just to check in with each other. So I will be staying, thank you. I will be staying here as long as possible, but there's a chance that I might have to leave before that 15 minutes is over, in which case I will reassign host duties to someone else. The conversation can continue. I will stop recording if we start to have more personal conversations rather than continuing the conversation with Joella. I think that is it for me. So Jerry, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
I'm going to hand it over to Joella. I think we have to do the prayer.
Yeah, it's the prayer for learning, I think, first.
Jill, you got that?
I'm going to share it one moment.
And if everybody would like to unmute for the prayer, that would be nice to hear participants' voices if you'd like to join us in the prayer.
Oops, that's not the right window. Oh, it's because it went to Google instead of, that's fun. One moment, please. It was working a moment ago. Give me just a second, folks. I'm sorry. Oh, there it is. It's just taking a long time to load.
It had to come from Israel. Okay. Ready, set, Baruch, Atah, Adonai, Eloheinu, Melech, Ha'olam, Asher, Kidshanu, B'mitzvotav, B'tzivanu, La'asok, B'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai our God, sovereign of all, who hallows us with mitzvot, commanding us to engage with words of Torah. Take it away, Joella.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you everybody for coming. Very exciting to see so many people. And I hope you enjoy. We're going to be learning about the lives of the first Jews to live in the city of Philadelphia. So I have a slideshow for you, which I'm going to start right now in my screen share. Okay, so everybody should be able to see this, and we are off. So Jews of Penn City, and part one is going to be the founders. And the way this is going to work is I broke up the slideshow into two parts. So the first part should run about 25 minutes or so, hopefully if I don't talk too much. And then we'll do a break for questions, and then part two, and then some more questions. So if possible, if you can kind of hold your questions for that middle section initially, I think that's going to work out well. So let's get started. So I'm beginning with a Philadelphia Jewish wedding, 1787. Benjamin Rush, who's not a Jew, was the most famous doctor in Philadelphia at that time, signer of the Declaration of Independence. One day he gets an invitation from one of his patients, that's Mrs. Phillips, who you see there at the bottom right, to attend her daughter's wedding. And he's pretty excited because he's never been to a Jewish wedding before. So he attends, he writes his long description to his wife all about it, which is wonderful. I recommend for you to read it. And he says, I asked the meaning after the ceremony was over of the canopy and the drinking of the wine and the breaking of the glass. So as you can see, it's a recognizable Jewish wedding. Jews are in Philadelphia doing their thing, getting married, explaining to the Goyim all their symbols and rituals. So how did this all start? How did the Jews get to Philly? So very simply, the Jewish community of Philadelphia has its origins from the Jewish community of New York. And the Jewish community of New York, I am labeling a mixed multitude. So you may have heard in the Jewish Museum that the New York Jewish community was really founded by some refugees from Brazil. They were fleeing the Inquisition. They were trying to go to the Netherlands, but they got caught in a storm. Then their ship was attacked by pirates. Yada, yada, yada. They end up in what was at that time New Netherlands, and they found really the Jewish New York community. And you see the sign there with the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, 1654. What's less talked about is after New York gets taken over by the British and actually becomes New York, you have another wave of immigration from London, which I guess makes sense. It's a British colony. And the London Jewish community was actually very new. It's only in the mid-1600s that England actually let people that Jews settle in England. They were kicked out in the 13th century. So you start having Jews really from all over Europe beginning to immigrate to London, from Spain and Portugal, but also from Germany, some from the Netherlands. And by the early 1700s, you actually have two synagogues in London, an Ashkenazi synagogue and a Sephardic synagogue. And those synagogues are kind of going to be the hubs of Jewish immigration to the New World. So, somebody might come in from Germany, they meet another Jew in Shul, they're like, hey, I got a cousin, he's in New York, like there's good business opportunities there. And that's kind of how it all gets started. And that's really going to be the group that is going to be founding Jewish Philadelphia. So meet the Franks and the Levies. We are starting to all the way on the upper end of the totem pole of the Jewish community. This is the elite. And these families are merchant families. We have in the middle Abigail Franks. Her father is Moses Levy. She married a guy called Jacob Franks, and then one of their sons is David Franks. And as you can see here on the slide, she writes, I'm very pleased with the proposal you make of David entering into partnership with my brother Nathan. So this is going to be the business partnership that's going to launch Jewish Philadelphia. It's David Franks, who you see pictured as a teenager, and his uncle, Abigail's brother, Nathan Levy. We don't have a portrait of Nathan Levy, so I've represented him by some sort of objects associated with him. Those are some of the books that he read. He loved playing the violin. And as you can see, these folks were not only wealthy, they were also highly well-educated, voracious readers. They were observant Jews as well, very interested in Jewish ideas. Nathan Levy, when he passed away, had a library of over 30 Hebrew books. So is Philadelphia going to be receptive to these new Jewish immigrants? Well, there's some good news. Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, of course, were founded by William Penn, who most people know was a Quaker. And some people know actually not only was a Quaker, but spent time imprisoned for his religious beliefs. So when he has the opportunity to found a new colony, it's very important to him that that experience does not happen to others. And he's going to write something called the Pennsylvania Charter of Liberties in 1701 that specifies, it says, no people can be truly happy if abridged of the freedom of their consciences as to religious profession and worship. So, and not only that, but there actually is never any state religion in Pennsylvania. So it really is a hospital place for people of different faiths. It's a very diverse area. Ben Franklin is writing in the Gazette at this time and says pretty nice things about Jews in the Gazette as well. So it is a hospitable environment. That said, are Jews 100% equal? No. In the same charter, it also says that if you want to serve in the government of Pennsylvania, you must be a Christian. So it's not 100%, but pretty good for merchants coming in like Levy and Franks. So here they come. They're going to open up their first business on Front Street, right near the port. And in time, their business grows, and they're going to move to a second location, which is on 2nd Street, really opposite where City Tavern is today, a home called the Slate Roof House. And if you go to that location today, you will see a little replica of the slate roof house. And is this replica here because that's where Levy and Franks are headquartered? Obviously not. It's because that was actually the house that William Penn was living in when he wrote the Charter of Privileges. So that's pretty kind of cool. So Franks and Levy actually lived in that same place later on. So how are they acclimating? Well, as you can see, pretty well. David Franks was single. Nathan Levy was older and already married with kids when they come. David Franks was single, and in 1743, he marries a lady named Margaret Evans, and in case you're wondering, not a Jew. Margaret was from an Anglican family, a prominent family. Her dad was the will registrar in the area. And they're going to settle into a townhome, which is sort of in the City Tavern area in Society Hill. But later on, they also buy a country house in Fairmount Park, which still stands today, called Woodford Mansion. So pretty nice lifestyle they have. And he's going to all the clubs. He's becoming a member of the Library Company of Philadelphia, Fishing Club, the Dancing Assembly. We see here his daughter, as time goes by, will be welcomed in these formal assemblies. We have here an excerpt from lines written in an assembly room by Joseph Shippen, talking about the different aristocratic ladies. He writes, with just such elegance and grace, fair, charming, swift appears, thus willing while she can please, thus Polly Franks endears. So we see Polly Franks really accepted as a member of the sort of high society of Philadelphia. Now, sadly, Polly Franks actually died young. And when she passed away, so you can still visit her grave, she will be buried at Christ Church because, like I said, her mother was Anglican. This was her family church. And maybe by this point, you're thinking, okay, Joella, so I'm hearing about Jews coming to Philly, but I don't feel like I'm really hearing about the founding of a Jewish community. It seems more like they're integrating into the existing Christian community. So never fear. Now it is time to transfer from the story of Mr. Franks to the story of Mr. Levy. So Nathan Levy sadly also lost a child in Philadelphia. We don't know if it was a boy or a girl. It happens early, around 1740. And to bury his child, he's not a member of any Christian congregation. And so he's going to ask the Penn family for a plot of land to bury his child. And they grant it. Over the years, it's enlarged, and that's going to become the Jewish cemetery for the Jewish community of Philadelphia. How accepted is this actual Jewish institution by the surrounding people? Well, you can see here at the bottom of the slide, in 1751, Nathan Levy complains in the Gazette that unthinking persons have fired several shots against the Jews' burying ground. Is there anti-Semitism involved? Who knows? He says it's unthinking persons. That said, there's really not any similar complaints in the Gazettes about people firing shots into Christian burying grounds. So I guess we'll kind of leave it at that. So this is really a case of kind of, if you build it, they will come. Once you have the cemetery, once you have the business of Levy and Franks established, more Jews start immigrating to the area. They know there'll be there a Jewish community. They know that they would get some help if they want to go into business. They have contacts now. And so you start having this development of Jewish life. And Nathan Levy is really taking the lead in organizing, a minyan for the men. And this happens very early. As far as I have been told, once you had about 12 men in the city of Philadelphia, basically 10 of them are praying together in a minyan. So you get that first prayer group opening up in Sterling Alley. And then there's going to be some rented quarters on Cherry Street. 1761, they get their first Torah scroll. 1770, the first donation to Israel. So here we go. We have a Jewish official. Now we have a congregation. And they start to have a Jewish neighborhood. And about 5 minutes away from Cherry Street is Elfreth's Alley. And that's actually where a lot of the Jews lived. It's the oldest continuously residential street in America. And there were several Jewish families that lived there in the later 1700s. And one of them that we know a lot about is the Mordechai family. They lived at number 118. Moses Mordechai was a merchant, not super successful merchant, specializing in cinnamon. He did not have the same kind of background as the Franks and the Levies. He immigrated to America as an indentured servant. And there are several other families that began that way, the Phillips family as well. And with Mordechai, actually, it appears he may have even been a convict, though we don't know the details of that. But after he finishes his indenture, he begins kind of peddling and then moves into the cinnamon trade. He was married to a lady named Esther Mordechai, which when I give tours, sometimes people say, oh my God, like how Jewish are these names? Like Moses and Esther Mordechai. However, Esther Mordechai actually was not born Jewish. She was born Elizabeth Whitlock. So she is a convert. When they married, she was about 16 years old. Moses Mordechai was in his 50s. So I don't know what her circumstances were, if there was a financial incentive or not. But we do see this kind of conversion to Judaism among people who were more on the lower rungs of social class. Among high society, we will see intermarriage, but you're not seeing high status Christians converting to Judaism. But you will see that for people with more lower economic status. So they raised a family in Elfreth's Alley, several boys. Their oldest son was named Jacob. That's actually the guy whose picture you see. And Jacob left Philly in his 20s, but in his later years, he actually wrote some memoirs about growing up in Philadelphia and sort of describing what it was like. And one of the details he describes is that coming home from school, he and some friends, there was an African-American lady who used to sell these really great pies in the street. And they really loved buying her pies. And if you look at sort of the left of the slide, you'll see an image. This is from the Museum of the American Revolution. The museum has created a space to kind of try to recreate Revolutionary era Philadelphia. And you can see the lady there with the pies. So that's from Jacob Mordechai's description. So lots of street food in Philly, but is it kosher? So early on, the Jews needed to slaughter their own kosher meat, but never fear. In the 1760s, Michael Gratz, immigrant from Poland, is coming to the rescue. And we have our first hechsher. I testify by this that I have killed the meat and examined the same as being shochet. All our brothers, the house of Israel, may eat. So I love the little D. I can almost like hear the Yiddish accent. And Jerry said before we started that they sold some kosher meat to Native Americans. I certainly believe it. They did a lot of development in Western Pennsylvania that we are going to be talking about. And speaking of Western Pennsylvania, well, Western at that time, so more like Pennsylvania Dutch country now. So you've got kosher meat. What about the moil? How are you going to circumcise your son? So we have Bernard Jacobs, the traveling moel of Heidelberg, PA, to the rescue. He will sort of serve the entire Pennsylvania region. We still have his book that he used, his record book. We still have it. It was actually preserved by Jacob Mordechai, so you see a bit of that. And you might be wondering, well, what are all these Jews doing in Pennsylvania Dutch country? Actually, they did a lot of trade with the West, the fur trade with the Native Americans. And so you had Jewish communities in Heidelberg, and Lancaster was a big community as well. And of course, many of them spoke German because they were coming from Germany. And so on that note, I have a short video clip to play for you, a little bit about that relationship between the Jewish and the German communities.
Hi, I'm Kurt Grotz. I'm with Waterhouse Studios in Aaronsburg, and I'm here to talk about the Aaronsburg story. In 2013, I moved to Aaronsburg, and one of the main reasons that I purchased my house was I discovered that it was right above the Salem Lutheran Church, which I learned was the site of the Aaronsburg story. The Aaronsburg story started in the late 1700s when a gentleman by the name of Aaron Levy donated land for a church, which became the Salem Lutheran Church, and he gave the parishioners a very fine pewter communion set made by a top pewter maker in the city of Philadelphia. And the long story short, in 1949, after the Holocaust, a gentleman by the name of Arthur Lewis was an aide to Governor Duff, and he was traveling across the state and came through Aaronsburg and saw that they were celebrating 150 years of this church. He found out about the gift from Aaron Levy, who was Jewish, to the Christians, and thought the story was so great that the state should join in the celebration. They ended up having a remarkable event at the fields next to the Salem Lutheran Church in Aaronsburg. A large mass of people descended on the town of Aaronsburg. Politically speaking, it was a mixture of Democrats and Republicans, but everybody was there on the same page to talk about tolerance and religious freedom. There were 3 main workshops. One of them dealt with religious tolerance in America. One of them dealt with racial equality among people. One of them dealt with prejudice, how you identify it and how you deal with people that are prejudiced. It was 10 years before Rosa Parks and 15 years before Martin Luther King. And it was just an amazing, amazing event right here in the Valley. There's Mark.
Okay, so as you can see, after the Holocaust, I think people were very excited to find some trace of, I guess, Jews and Germans getting along. The relationship wasn't always perfect between the Jews and the German community, and we will be seeing a little bit of evidence of that later on in the presentation. But I wanted to take some time now to address one of the things that the clip brought up, which is the issue of racial equality and civil rights. Clearly, in colonial Philadelphia,
Hi, I'm Kurt Grotz.
That did not exist. We don't often associate American slavery with the northern colonies, but of course, all American colonies participated in the institution of slavery, and Pennsylvania was no different. William Penn owned enslaved people, and the Philadelphia Jews participated to a similar extent to their Gentile neighbors. The ones who were merchants, a few of them in some of the ships that they either invested in or owned, did transport enslaved people. This was not the majority of what their business was by any means, but they did not abstain from it either. Over time, especially within the Quaker community, there began to be growing a anti-slavery movement in Philadelphia. And this culminates near the end of the Revolutionary War, where also there's new ideas circulating about freedom. And Pennsylvania does become the first state to pass something called a Gradual Abolition Act, which will put the state on the slow but steady course, I guess, to phasing out the institution of slavery. And in those post-revolutionary times, we do have a few members of the Jewish community who were active in the anti-slavery cause, but not many. It's not like the civil rights movement in the 1960s where Jews are active, out of proportion to their numbers. We don't see that in this case. So, it is a difficult thing to talk about, but it's something that we've definitely been grappling with as a nation, and it's part of our history, and it's part of Jewish history as well. So on that note, I think this is going to be a good place to sort of pause the slideshow and take some questions. And then after questions, we'll resume again with the Revolutionary War and that experience. So I'm going to stop this screen share. All right.
If anybody has questions, please type them in the chat. And
Yeah,
Joella, I saw a comment come in. Somebody had said that for as many times as they've been to Alfred's Alley, this is the first they were hearing of the Jewish history there.
Yeah, and there were multiple families. I highlighted the Mordechai family, but the Chazan of Mikveh Israel later on, Jacob Raphael Cohen lived there. There's about, I think, maybe as many as 4 documented Jewish homes there. Question, did the intermarried men participate in Jewish life? Yeah, that's a great question. So, for example, David Franks, yeah, he never converted, and he did participate, especially socially. Like, he was still very active in promoting other Jewish men, especially in business. So like Michael Gratz was a clerk for David Frank. So he was very involved in sort of helping young Jewish men. He was involved in, like, he'd be, assisting them with wills and other documents. So he's very much part of the Jewish community, despite intermarrying. Yeah, the Polly Franks. Yeah, I'm not sure. So she was not married. I don't know what the deal is with the missus. I was wondering that myself. It could just be sort of respect, or whoever kind of wrote that dedication. How dovetails with Newport. Yeah, so Newport is sort of more notorious as really a center of the slave trade, and the Jews in Newport much more you had some who were much more heavily involved in the slave trade. When it comes to Philadelphia, it's pretty small scale. David Franks is really the most involved, and we really only have 2 documented voyages that he was, that we know from newspaper ads that he was involved with. Nathan Levy, even less. It's basically 3 individuals in the very early years, and then that's it. So it's pretty marginal. For the most part, their business was, as Jerry was talking about, a lot with the fur trade and development of the West, also the East Indies. But there was, like I said, some participation absolutely in the slave trade. It stood for mistress of maybe more social rank. Yeah. And you see that among women. I mean, she was young, but you definitely see among women who, never married, as they reach middle age, starting to be called misses, and it's more a sign of respect in those times. Yeah. Any others? I see Jerry said he would like to add comments about David Franks. So yeah, Jerry, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. That was fascinating. I can't wait till part 2. I just want to point out that David Franks was president of the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue of Montreal, which was the oldest Jewish congregation in Canada. And
Jerry, I apologize for interrupting you. Yeah. It's actually the other David Franks.
The other David Franks.
We will be talking about him. Yeah.
Right. Are you going to be talking about him?
Yeah, well, he'll be in part 2.
Oh, no, then I was already thinking about.
No problem. Yeah, this is the great, I was actually going to say in part 2, it's one of the jokes among people who are into Jewish Philly that there are 2 David Frankses in this era of Jewish Philadelphia, which is kind of insane. Yeah, Jerry, have you visited Woodford, the home of the?
Oh, yeah, there. Yeah. And where he's buried, and I won't tell until you do. I forget, were they related or is that a coincidence?
I think distantly related.
Okay.
Yeah, I see there were several Jewish families who purchased land from William Penn. Yeah, yeah, I mean, they date way back, absolutely.
Oh, by the way, I was just kind of joking, but you thought I said, did they sell kosher meat to the American? I said to the American Indians. Did they?
Yeah, probably they did, because they had a lot of business with, yeah, they had a lot of business with the American Indians, and there were kosher butchers in Pennsylvania, you know, in that area. So it's absolutely possible. But yeah, the bigger thing for the kosher meat was actually exporting it to the Jews of Barbados.
Really?
Yeah, that's actually what it was. Yeah, it was not for local consumption necessarily. It was export to the Jewish community of Barbados that was having trouble procuring kosher meat.
Wow. Was it Foremost Kosher hot dogs or that was too early?
I don't know. It was
Too early for that.
Michael Gratz, we got to meet. That was how I thought of it, especially when I saw the demi de. Yeah, I think people think of like the early Jews as Sfaradim, but actually, as you can see, a lot of them were Yiddish speaking and Ashkenazi, especially in Philadelphia.
I thought maybe it was Dutch. It was, you know, like.
Cool. All right. Looks like it looks like we're ready for part 2. Any other questions? Okay, great. So we're on to part 2. I will start this screen share again. Okay, so part 2, I'm labeling citizens. So Jews were involved in the American Revolution, definitely, and in the lead up to it as well. So going back to 1765, we see with the protest against the Stamp Act, the issue of taxation without representation, there were 9 Jewish merchants in Philadelphia that signed the non-importation agreement of 1765, which is basically an agreement to boycott British goods in protest against the Stamp Act. And then once the war starts, many of the young men from these Philadelphia families did participate in the fighting. The one who reached sort of the highest rank was Colonel Solomon Bush. And sadly, he was wounded actually defending the city of Philadelphia as the British were coming in to occupy it. His brother was killed in that same fighting. He did eventually recover from his wounds, and Solomon Bush actually becomes the first Jewish member of the Anti-Slavery Society. So that's for him. So Philadelphia, though, the British did win. So Philadelphia is now occupied by the British. So I've turned the screen red in their honor. And many of the revolutionary supporting Jews will leave the city. For example, the Gratz family goes to Lancaster, but some people remain for various reasons. The only family we know of who was more sympathetic to the British side were the Franks family. And especially Rebecca Franks really, really loved the British officers. So we have here an account from a neighbor that the British General Howe really enjoyed the society of the chatty Miss Franks. They would chase each other from the house to the street and then back again. So she definitely was making herself conspicuous. And even more so, at the end of the occupation, after 10 months, the British do decide to withdraw, basically because the French got into the war and they didn't think that they could hold Philly against the French. But they don't really want to seem like they're leaving sort of with their tail between their legs. And so they decide to have this massive going away party. And it's called the Meshianza. It's just like totally crazy. And it's medieval themed. So you got men dressed up as medieval knights. And supposedly they're vying for the favors of certain selected high society ladies. And one of those selected ladies is Miss Rebecca Franks. So she is serving this really prominent role in this party. And clearly all this is not really going to benefit the Franks family once the revolutionaries are back in charge after the withdrawal. David Franks also really doesn't help himself. There's a letter that he sends that is intercepted by the revolutionaries, where he is complaining somewhat about the revolution, saying that they're sort of locking people up for no reason. And he says something like, "What a sad situation, Great Britain has left its friends." So of course that it kind of implies that he's more sympathetic to the British. So things begin to snowball, and eventually David Franks is basically ejected from the state of Pennsylvania, his daughter too, and so they have to leave for New York, which is British occupied. Becky eventually marries a British officer and will live out the rest of her life in England. And apparently later on really, really regretted that she didn't support the revolution after she saw how well it did. But that's it for the Frankses. But yeah, they're the only really known prominent loyalist family in Philly. And now, since we talked about David Franks, we've got to get to, as Jerry was pointing out, the other David Franks. So there was also a patriot David Franks, and he's the one who hails from Montreal. And yes, he was president of the synagogue in Montreal, but he is a huge supporter of the revolutionary cause. So he actually leaves Montreal, joins the Continental Army, serves with distinction. And now let's fast forward several decades. And he, unfortunately, in the 1790s, is going to pass away during a terrible epidemic in Philadelphia. It was the yellow fever epidemic. And this was just an awful time. People were sort of dying right and left. People were being buried in mass graves, maybe a bit similar to sort of what's happening in India now, unfortunately. And the story goes, David Franks had passed away, and his body was on like a cart, literally about to go be buried in this mass grave, when his neighbor recognized it and said, "Wait a minute, this is David Franks. He's the hero of the American Revolution. He shouldn't go to a mass grave." And so he rescues the corpse, and he has him buried instead in his own family plot, which was in Christ Church burial ground. So that is why if you go to Christ Church burial ground, you will see a memento for the former president of the Montreal synagogue. The Jew who probably played the greatest role in actually helping us win the war was not a soldier, but was a broker. That is Chaim Salomon. And Chaim Salomon was an immigrant from Poland, spoke many European languages, and was in New York at the start of the war. He was a firebrand revolutionary involved in the Sons of Liberty. He got arrested by the British. But then when they learned of his language skills, they were actually using him as a translator to communicate with their Hessian mercenaries who were German speaking. But Solomon kind of tricked them. He was translating, but he was also trying to convince the Hessians to desert and not continue to fight against the revolution. And so when the British found that out, they were like, "That's it, we're going to hang Chaim Salomon," at which point somehow he manages to escape. He flees to Philadelphia, and that's where he's going to open up a very successful brokerage business. His language skills really help because he's able to deal with different European financial institutions. And he's going to work very closely with Robert Morris, who was the head basically of US finances during the war. This is a statue of Robert Morris outside the bank, the second bank, Philadelphia. So if you look in the memoirs of Robert Morris, and from that time, the phrase, "I went to Chaim Salomon" appears, I think it's like more than 60 times. So this was a very close and important relationship. This was how things got funded, like Washington, during the Battle of Yorktown. He would sort of turn to Morris for the fundraising, and then Morris would turn to Chaim Salomon. So for his contributions, that's why Chaim Salomon was honored with a stamp as financial hero. Later on, he goes on to give interest-free loans to American government figures, including James Madison. So definitely one of the standout heroes of the revolution. And yes, he's later on in his life, there are some wars regarding different banks in Philadelphia, and there's some comments in the news about Jew brokers. And there's a letter to the editor attributed to Chaim Salomon. He basically says, "Yes, I'm Jewish and I'm a broker, and I'm not ashamed of either of those things. Why should I be?" So I think pretty good for him. Now, Mikveh Israel has a banner outside of it, Synagogue of the American Revolution. And you might think, okay, well, they're a synagogue. They were around during the American Revolution. So I guess it makes sense. That's how they refer to themselves. But there is a little bit more to it, which is I've explained to you that the British occupied Philadelphia during the war for about 10 months. Well, the British occupied New York for about over 6 years. And because of that, the Jewish community of New York, which was mostly supporting the revolution, pretty much picks up and moves to Philly. And that's going to include the Chazan of the New York Shul, Gershon Satius, and he's going to become the Chazan of Mikveh Israel. So you suddenly have this huge increase of the Jewish population of Philadelphia, and they're going to be joined as the war starts hitting down south with Jews coming in from the south as well. So that's going to create what I'm calling the Great Colonial Jewish Meetup, really the Great Revolutionary Colonial Jewish Meetup, which is fabulous news for Jewish single people. Because if you read letters from American Jews from this period, you're going to hear a common refrain of like, I really wish I could marry a Jewish spouse, but like, it's really slim pickings. At the time of the Revolutionary War, the entire Jewish population of Philly is around 100 people. So, imagine that. So it's very exciting to have so many more people, so many more Jews around. I'm sure there are multiple matches formed in this period. Two that we know about are in the Mordechai family. Jacob Mordechai is going to fall in love with and marry a lady from New York, Judy Myers, the daughter of the famous silversmith, Meyer Myers. And more scandalous is from the elder generation, which is the remarriage of Mrs. Esther Mordechai. As I told you, there's a big age difference between Mr. and Mrs. Mordechai. And Moses Mordechai passes away during the Revolutionary War, just of natural causes. And Esther Mordechai is starting to struggle financially. We have records that the congregation, Mikveh Israel, was pitching in and helping her pay her rent. So into this situation walks in Mr. Jacob Cohen, who is a Jew coming in from the South. And he falls in love with Mrs. Mordechai. He is determined to marry her. Seems like this is great news, right? Well, the congregation Mikveh Israel says absolutely not. They tell the Chazan, we inform you, you are not to marry Mr. Jacob Cohen to Mrs. Mordechai. Why? Well, Jacob Cohen is a real Cohen. And under Jewish law, Kohanim are not supposed to marry converts. So this marriage is forbidden. How much do Mr. Cohen and Mrs. Mordechai care? Not very much. They got married, their ketubah, we still have it to this day. And one of the witnesses who signed their ketubah is none other than Chaim Solomon himself. So as you can see, considerable support within the Jewish community for their defiance of some of the rules. Still, synagogue is feeling good. There's a large community now. And that's when they say, okay, there's a lot of people. It's time to us to build our first actual synagogue building, no more rented quarters. And so we have the first synagogue building in Philadelphia, 1782. It was on Cherry Street. You can see there's still a plaque there, not without some struggles. So the initial plot of land that they purchased was next door to a German church. And the German church said, Jews, we don't really want you setting up a synagogue next door. You will disturb us. And so the Jews actually had to raise more money to buy a second plot of land to build their shul. But still, they were very excited, lots of nice speeches at the inauguration. But there will be problems in the future. Let's see if you can figure out the problem. I just said there were so many Jews in Philly because of the war. Well, now the war has ended and the New Yorkers start skedaddling back to New York. Chazan Satius leaves, goes back to New York. The Southerners going back to the South. All of a sudden, the Jewish congregation has about half the number of people, and yet they're suddenly stuck with this building. So they're running into some trouble. What are they going to do? They appeal to the Gentile community. And the Gentile community responds, and especially the members of Christ Church, including Ben Franklin, contribute. And that really means a lot to the Jewish community. Eventually, they actually are going to hold a lottery to finish, get them out of their financial difficulties. But they say they're never going to forget the contributions of the Christ Church members, and they don't. And you really have this nice relationship developing between the two congregations. When you fast forward to the 20th century, Christ Church was having some issues. The beautiful window that you see here in their sanctuary, there was an accident and all of the glass got shattered. And so Mikveh Israel saw the opportunity to step up, and they paid for restoration of the glass. And if you walk into Christ Church, unfortunately, it's not in the picture, but kind of behind this pillar, you will see a little gold plaque with a quote from the Hebrew Bible and an acknowledgement of the donation of Mikveh Israel to the window. And Christ Church and Mikveh Israel actually have an annual kosher fellowship lunch every year to kind of cement the relationship. And you can see that in the photo. So things seem to be going well for the Jews, but are they actually equal yet? Are they full citizens in Pennsylvania or in the United States? So for Pennsylvania, the answer is no, not yet at this time. So when Pennsylvania writes a new constitution after the Revolutionary War, it includes a clause that if you want to serve in the Pennsylvania government, there's an oath to swear you in. And the oath says that you believe in the truth of both the Old and the New Testaments. So of course, if you are an observant Jew, you're not going to be able to participate. And Mikveh Israel protests this. This is when the war is over. They feel like members of the Jewish community have served with distinction. They helped fight and make this country, and this is just not right. And so they get together and protest to the Pennsylvania legislature, but the Pennsylvania legislature does not change anything. And that's the situation when the Constitutional Convention comes into town. And Jonas Phillips is very concerned that if they write the federal constitution and has a similar oath, basically Jews are going to be second-class citizens, maybe forever. It's going to be really hard to change. So he is going to write a letter to George Washington and the Constitutional Convention saying, please don't have a federal oath like what they have in Pennsylvania. He writes, the Israelites will think themselves happy to live under a government where all religious societies are on an equal footing. I wish I could tell you that the members of the convention read this letter and they said, okay, Phillips is right. We're definitely not going, they're convinced by his arguments. The reality is when they received the letter, they had already decided that there was not going to be a religious test for federal office. But it is very cool that he was so passionate about it, and more so in light that his grandson, Henry Meyer Phillips, is actually going to become the first Jewish federal congressman from the Philadelphia area. And the fountain that you see there in the picture right in front of the art museum is actually named after Henry Phillips, the congressman. So it is inscribed there on the base. So that's a pretty amazing Jewish story that's really linked to this really sort of iconic Philadelphia location. So Constitution has been written. Now it's time for the states to ratify. And by the 4th of July, 1788, enough states have ratified that Philadelphia knows that the Constitution is going to go into effect. So they celebrate with a big party and with a huge march, with a parade. And there's lots of floats going by, and mostly people are marching according to their professions. So you see there on the slide, you have the flag that the Carpenters Company carried in this parade. And then you're also going to have the clergy marching. And as you can see, it was the clergy of the different Christian denominations with the rabbi of the Jews walking arm in arm. So the Jews are really sort of embraced at this moment. And the city also had food set up. It had snack food set up for the people who came to watch the parade, and that actually is going to include a kosher table as well. And you can see it had some salmon and nuts and raisins. So Jews are really participating in this moment. And that trend will continue in the inauguration of Washington. Gershom Statius, the Chazan, will be attending the first presidential inauguration in New York as well. And the next year, Pennsylvania revisits this issue about qualifications to serve in office. And this time, with very little debate, the law is changed. And so now enabling Jews to serve in Pennsylvania government and leading them to full citizenship. So that would be a lovely note to conclude on, but I want to go a little bit further and instead sort of end with the story of Rebecca Gratz and get into a little bit of this issue of the next generation. So Rebecca Gratz, from the famous Gratz family, she was actually born during the Revolutionary War. She never married. She was heavily involved in many charitable organizations, mostly specializing in aiding women and children in poverty. But as she reaches her middle years, she really becomes concerned with the state of the Jewish community, and not really about anti-Semitism, though that definitely is an issue, but that they're getting too comfortable and that basically Jewish youth have sort of lost touch with Judaism. They're just going to be assimilating out of existence. No one speaks Hebrew. When they go to synagogue, they don't really understand what it's all about. And so she basically is going to embark on sort of a one-woman campaign to sort of bring American Jewry into, I guess, the 19th century. And basically that's going to embody less Hebrew, more English, and more inclusion of women into religious life. So step one is she convinces the rabbi at Mikveh Israel to start giving an English sermon as part of Shabbat services, which is very popular among the women. And then step two is she, of course, founds the famous Hebrew Sunday school that you see on the slide. And really, it wasn't a Hebrew school, it was a Judaism school. It was all in English. And basically the point was to teach Jewish children sort of about Judaism, about sort of the precepts, about the Bible and the different stories and the meaning of the stories of the Bible, and about holidays as well. They would have oral exams at the end of the year that parents could attend so they could see what the kids were learning. And the idea was basically to establish some, emotional tie to the Jewish faith among the new generation. So this was an enormous success. It was copied in several other cities. It's estimated that at one point, about 80% of practicing Jewish households in Philadelphia, their kids were enrolled in this school. And it was not a synagogue-based school. By this time, there were other synagogues in Philly as well, including Rodef Shalom. And so the school was open to everyone, regardless of synagogue affiliation. It was meant to be really accessible and worked really well once Jewish immigration picked up to sort of integrate the new immigrants as well. And I sort of wanted to end with Rebecca Gratz because I think in some ways, the things that she thought about and struggled with are very relatable to people, living now as American Jews. Some of the things that involved the earlier generation, it's difficult for us to relate to these early Jews. But in this way, I think almost we relate to them maybe better than some of the Jews that came in the later period, because as the 18th century progresses, anti-Semitism really begins to pick up in the United States. And you're going to stop seeing Jews being welcomed to all the social clubs and being welcomed among the Christian community the way that I've been describing in this earlier period. So in some ways, we are actually resembling these early Jews more than some of the later ones. So on that note, I'm going to open this up for questions. And then if there's time left over, maybe I can share some more stories with you, but I'm definitely looking forward to hearing some questions and hearing your thoughts. So I'm going to stop the screen share. All right.
Several questions came in through the chat, Joella.
Okay, fabulous. I'm seeing some hands as well. So I'm going to start with the chat, and then if we see hands, I'm happy to call on some people personally. So can the Cohen Mordechai Ketubah be seen publicly? I'm not sure. I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure where it is held. I was struggling on Google Images. That was a terrible image of it. So I would have to look into that, but I don't know where it is. Joella, how did you get into this field and how did you gather this wonderful information? Thank you. So Well, by training, I was actually an attorney for years, but I didn't like that so much. I really love history. So I think back in 2014, I started to get involved in sort of dabbling in Philadelphia history. I started to be a docent at some historical homes. First one was the Physic House in Society Hill, then the Powell House. So kind of homes from this revolutionary early America era. Later, I've worked at the Museum of the American Revolution. And then so it made sense, being Jewish myself, to of course get interested in the Jewish history. And like I said, I've been giving tours with Jerry for years of Jewish Philadelphia as well. And how did I gather the info? Honestly, a lot of it, there's a book called The Jews of Philadelphia from Colonial Times Through the Age of Jackson. It's like this thick. And so a huge percentage of that's sort of like the groundwork. And it's like way more detailed than anything I gave. And then after that, there are other sources as well. I read a biography of Rebecca Gratz. Some of these people, you can Google them, some of the more prominent people. I saw in researching this presentation that Rabbi Soloveitchik actually has a whole YouTube series about Jonas Phillips. He got really interested in him. So people are coming out and taking an interest in some of these different characters. Rebecca Gratz was so beautiful and accomplished. Is there any story about why she didn't marry? I think I heard she was inspiration for the heroine of Ivanhoe. Yes, a fabulous question. So I did mention that because I just read this big fat biography that seemed to imply that was a little bit more of a myth. Why didn't she marry? Definitely. So many of her brothers and sisters intermarried, and she definitely did seem that she wanted to marry somebody Jewish, and she did not have a lot of Jewish boyfriends. So the men that she was dating that we know that were accompanying her to these balls and assemblies were all Christians. There is a story, there was a Christian man named Samuel Ewing that she was very close to for many years. And many people said that that was really the love of her life and that they didn't marry because of the difference in religion. And that is certainly possible. There is a story, she was very close to the family, and he passed away relatively young. He married another Christian woman, passed away relatively young. And it said that when he passed, Rebecca Gratz went to approach like the coffin, and she left there a little picture of herself and like a rose, and then like swept off. So it's like very romantic. And as far as her being the inspiration for Ivanhoe, very possible. The story goes that she knew Washington Irving, and then Washington Irving knew Sir Walter Scott, who wrote Ivanhoe. And so Washington Irving had met Rebecca Gratz and was so impressed with her and was talking about her with Sir Walter Scott. And he was inspired by some of those stories and put that into the character of Rebecca Gratz. So very possible. And I don't want to go on too long right now, but maybe if we have a little bit of time at the end, there actually is another Jewish woman who inspired a different novel character. And that didn't make it into my slides, but I probably am going to maybe try to tell that story before we end. But I do want to get to some more questions. The niece of, just making sure you didn't miss the question above. It wasn't that unusual for Christians and Jews contributing to each other's fundraising, right? No, exactly. Yeah, it really was something that happened in early Philly. To each other's fundraising, and also just different community organizations. So we see Jews, contributing to the Philadelphia Hospital. We see Jews on different boards. So for example, the president of Mikveh Israel was on the board of the first women's not higher education, but at least better education. There was a Philadelphia Female Academy that was established after the revolution and had many clergy members on its board, and the head of Mikveh Israel as well. So you absolutely see this kind of cross multi-denominational approach. That was not true all over America. That was very much a Philadelphia thing and part of Philadelphia culture, for sure. The niece of Congressman Henry Meyer Phillips, Elizabeth Phillips Samuel, left a lot of money to Fairmount Park. Absolutely, there's a gorgeous sculpture garden, and really his relationship to Fairmount Park, I think, is actually why the fountain is there, more so than his congressional service. Yes. Yeah, so I see a hand from the Ben Zion family, so maybe if they can be unmuted, I'd be happy to take a question.
Okay, it's Jane.
Jane, yeah.
I have a comment and a question.
Yes.
I guide at Woodford.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
So I just wanted to mention that there is a portrait of, it is Bila Abigail Levy Franks. And
Yes.
there's a beautiful portrait on the top floor of Woodford. And the whole tour of Woodford is really fascinating. Hopefully the houses will be open shortly, but I don't think that, I know they're not open now. I'm not guiding. And also, you did a great job. I think your presentation's terrific.
Well, thank you.
I years ago, I looked for the history of Jews in Philadelphia for Hadassah, and I really couldn't find anything. I was very curious about the Gratz family, and I have a feeling that they all intermarried, and they're no longer Jews in the Gratz family. But I don't know. I couldn't find anything further than around 1850 or so.
Mm.
So I was wondering about the Gratz family.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. They didn't all intermarry immediately, but I don't know now if there are any Jewish Gratzes. I feel like I should know it, but I don't. That is a good question. It was there was, some Jewish continuity there. So I know one of the members, like maybe a niece or something of Rebecca Gratz, actually married with the Mordecai family, who it was another family that saw a lot of intermarriage. But these families were so large, so you might have like 7 kids, and then 3 will never marry, and then 4 will intermarry, and then 1 might marry a Jew. So a lot of times it kind of went that way, and that's how it was with the Mordecais. And actually, that branch I know wrote a whole memoir about Rebecca Gratz, from her niece who was from the Mordecais. So there was some Jewish continuity, but whether it's reached into today, I'm not sure. One branch of the Gratz family married into the Clays of Kentucky, and so you have all this Gratz stuff out in Kentucky. But yeah, they're definitely not Jews. So yeah, thank you for that comment. I'm glad you liked what I had to say. When I heard you were from Woodford, I was like, oh, I hope I got it right with David Franks. But yeah, it's a wonderful place to visit. It's amazing that we have a home like this, from that Jewish community. So
I think
yeah,
Jeffrey is raising his hand.
Yes, if anybody's
Jeffrey,
raising their hand.
Yeah, Jeffrey, you're going to have to, I'm asking you to unmute. You'll have to click the little button.
How about now? Okay.
Yes.
Good. There was a highly influential Roberta Gratz in New York. Is there any connection there? She was very influential in historic districting in historic districts and the Landmarks Commission in New York.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I don't know the answer to that. So maybe that can be researched. So yeah, I tell you what, I'm happy to take more questions. Since there's so much interest in the Gratz family, like I said, I did have one more story which I didn't get to share. So since we have a little bit of time, maybe I'll just share it now, even though I'm not presenting a slide. Sort of in this interrelationship between the Gratzes and the Mordecais. So Jacob Mordecai ends up moving down south with his family. And he actually opens a female educational establishment in North Carolina. And his kids become the teachers, including his eldest daughter, Rachel Mordecai. And she is a very committed teacher, very voracious reader. And there's a woman named Maria Edgeworth who wrote a lot about education and also wrote a lot of novels, very popular at that time. And she was really Rachel's most favorite writer. But the problem was most of her novels, anytime there was a Jewish character, it was like a total Shylock, anti-Semitic stereotype. And Rachel Mordecai was upset by this. And so she went and she wrote a letter to Maria Edgeworth and said, very polite, I love your work. I'm a huge admirer, but hey, what's up with the anti-Semitism? And Maria read the letter and she thought, you know what, she's right. Why am I doing this? I don't really know why I'm doing this. So what she decided to do is she actually went and wrote a whole new novel that was basically about anti-Semitism. It's called Harrington and basically explores the origin of anti-Semitism. And it basically follows the hero growing up and sort of being very anti-Semitic to later on in life is going to fall in love with a lovely Jewish woman and so on. And the Jewish woman who's the heroine, she actually took words from Rachel Mordecai's letter and like put it in the mouth of her heroine. So there's absolutely no debate that this particular fictional character was based on Rachel Mordecai. And Rachel Mordecai and Rebecca Gratz actually met once. There was one day in the 1830s when Rachel Mordecai came to visit in Philadelphia. And she's forgotten now, but at that time she was a celebrity. Everybody in Mikveh Israel had read that book. This was before Ivanhoe. This was like the first book that had positive female characters. Everybody knew about the letter. Everybody knew she was the inspiration. And so she's this big celebrity. So they seat her right next to Rebecca Gratz, to honor her. But what they don't know is Rachel Mordecai has actually become disillusioned with Judaism, no longer believes in it, and wants to leave the Jewish faith and convert. And this is not because of marriage. Her husband is a Jew. Her husband is heartbroken by this. It's really because she just read a lot about Judaism and she feels more convinced by Christianity. And I thought it's sort of an interesting tale in terms of like these two women, and they really, both inspiring different characters and both sort of seeking these different paths. We think about sort of the disparity, the nature of Jewish community in the U.S. So that was my extra supplemental story. Let me see if I have any more questions or thoughts. Does she convert? So at the very end of her life, she kind of, she's basically de facto, like sort of, she's like teaching her kids about Jesus and stuff, and her husband is really upset. Her father is heartbroken. Jacob Mordecai in later life sort of really returns to Judaism, and he's sort of heartbroken, but converting really, I think it was like on her deathbed that she officially does it. Yeah, so actually in terms of recommending books, there's a book called Mordecai that's a doctoral dissertation that really goes into the family, that tells a lot. They're a family that were huge writers, so there's just a ton of information, and it's a really interesting look into this family in early America. I do recommend that. Okay. Look at that. I thought I wasn't going to finish, and I finished.
I think I see a couple of hands up.
Oh, you do? Yeah, please.
Yes. Carl, I'm asking you to unmute.
The Seixas family were conversos from Iberia, Spain and Portugal. And I think they disappeared into the non-Jewish world. Were all the Seixases in Philadelphia acknowledged to be Jewish, self-identified as Jewish?
I mean, at the time, they definitely did. They were a very prominent family. Gershom Seixas, very prominent. I think this story of disappearance, from what I've heard, this whole generation, basically, the thing was they faced two issues. One was, a relatively welcoming Christian environment, and the other was just tiny numbers. And they also were, especially these elite families we're talking about, were prideful. And, when Jewish immigration begins to increase, they don't necessarily intermarry with those new immigrants. So I think there's a lot, even though they founded institutions, they didn't really found that much of the Jewish population. It's kind of like they founded institutions, and those institutions were then used by later immigrants who were coming in from Germany and then Eastern Europe and all the later waves that came in. But they themselves kind of either assimilated, or a lot of them just didn't marry, really. Yes, thank you. That was the book I was citing, The History of the Jews. Yes.
I saw another hand up. It's a Snurim. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Is that what I have to do?
Yep, you're good. I can hear you.
Oh, okay. We've heard a lot about the Jewish community intermarrying and fading into the larger Philadelphia community. My question is, nowadays, to bring the story up to date, which we did a little bit here, are there people in Philadelphia today who track back to the well-known and famous Jewish families that we've been talking about?
Yeah, so that's a great question. You're exposing all the stuff that I don't know, which is great for the future. I will say that I did read a book about some of the original New York families, like from those immigrants actually that came in from the Portuguese refugees. And at least as of the 1960s and 70s, there were still descendants. There's actually a photo of them posing with a memorial. So they're still around. So I have to think somebody is still around. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not aware of them and how public they are in terms of the heritage. That's a great question. And by the way, if you're interested in these families, I should mention the Rosenbach Museum. I forget the affiliation, but they have a lot of Gratz portraits there, and there was interconnection there with Gratz families. So that is a great place to hear more information about the Gratzes, and it's a really great museum to visit. You can take a tour of the house there, and that's really another really good site. I don't know if they're open now, but when they do, it's a really great Jewish historical site in Philadelphia.
Where is that again?
The Rosenbach Museum. It's on, I think it's around like 12th and Delancey. It's called the Rosenbach.
It's like 20th and Delancey.
Yeah, thank you.
Where is it, Delancey? I'm from New York, so you're saying it's in the city. I'll look for it.
Yeah, it's in the city.
It's in
downtown.
Philadelphia.
Yeah, just Center City.
Philadelphia?
Just write it down. Rosenbach, Rosen, Rosen, Bach, Bach.
And that's Philadelphia or New York?
Philadelphia.
Oh, Philadelphia. Oh,
Philadelphia, yes.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Yeah, thank you, somebody. And thank you, Jill, for putting it in the chat.
I see that Gail has raised her hand.
Great.
So for your own study or information, and if you're going to give tours in the future, do you have a sort of a new area that you're looking into? Just wondering what's next for you in this field, Joella.
Wow, thank you. It's a great question. Well, in terms of the Jewish history, yeah, I do kind of focus more on the early days, but as time goes on, I've learned more about Jews from other eras. I have given some like bus tours, nowadays there's like none of that's going on. But I have given some bus tours where, once you can travel more, you can deal with more eras. As Jerry mentioned, I used to work as a guide at the Eastern State Penitentiary historic site, which actually has a synagogue, the first prison synagogue. So I do get into some of the later history. Once you get into the Civil War era, the head of the Rabbi at Mikveh Israel, Rabbi Moraes, was actually very involved, and he was actually very loud in denouncing slavery, was a member of the Union League, and also visited prisoners. And even going up to contemporary times, you have a Jewish lady who founded mural arts. So, I have done where you kind of more that broader, I've done some of that with teenagers, where I'll basically have I like to do it through biography. So I have like a little printing of like different portraits of different Jews of Philadelphia, and it has some colonial era, but some from other eras as well. And then kind of as we go through the history, they learn about different, Jewish members of Philadelphia history. So that's been really fun. And for myself, so I'm not a Philadelphian, I just play one on Zoom. I'm from New Jersey. So something I've personally done over the past few months is actually I gave a local series about the history of South Jersey, which didn't have a lot of Jews in it. For early colonial South Jersey, is pretty much all about the Quakers and Native Americans and stuff like that. But it was really, really fun to learn about, and I think kind of helped me understand more in general about the history of the era, which is great. And I see one more hand up again.
Yes, Benzion and Shane, I've just asked you to unmute.
Okay. I just have a comment about Abigail Franks. She was terribly concerned that her son, David, married out.
Yes.
And she wrote this beautiful, articulate letter. And all her, I don't think many, there were a lot of siblings, but most of them married out. And so she was, of course, concerned. And I she said she would never speak to him again. I don't think she ever did.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, Abigail Franks, I believe that she did not have any Jewish grandchildren. And this is a lady who, you know, kept kosher, like she was writing letters to her kids, like make sure you keep kosher. You know, it's really tough. And at the same time, I've read that some of her letters, she can be a little bit disparaging about Jewish practices. Like she's very Jewish, but she'll say, oh, look, we should get away from some of our superstitions. So like there's this weird like love-hate where there's a lot of pride, but there's also this kind of feeling like, oh, we're old-fashioned, we're not really up there with, you know, modern America. And maybe that's, you know, they were struggling to how to kind of fit Judaism into this new world as well. And she was sort of a part of that as well. But yeah, there was so much heartbreak between families over this. It's tragic. And I haven't read all her letters, but I know that they're a wonderful read. It's really a great original source from that period. So thank you for bringing that up. And she's kind of the founding mother of Jewish Philly, even though she wasn't here, because that's basically her son and her brother who found Jewish Philly. So she's got that. All right, so it looks like it's 11:15, so I'm going to turn this over to Jerry to sign us out.
Okay, that was great. You know, I can't tell you how much I and everybody enjoyed. If you look at the comments, it's like 5 stars. So Joella, mazel tov, really. I even see people clapping. It's for Debbie and Mark. Thank you. And Jill, terrific tech angeling. You're an angel. You're an angel. I just wanted to just add a couple things. One of my alma maters, Gratz College, Gratz College was established by Hyman Gratz, and he said that by a certain point, if no heirs had children, he would give the money to Gratz College. So he eventually ran out of family, and so did Rebecca, obviously. So that's why I was able to attend Gratz College, because they had no grandchildren. So it was side benefit. And also those Gratzes really got around. I'm not sure if people know, but there is a town of Gratz, Pennsylvania, near Harrisburg. That was one of the Gratzes wandered over there. And also in Lexington, Kentucky, there's a neighborhood called Gratz Park, and that also was part of the Gratz family. So they were like multiplying like rabbits all over the United States, just not in Philadelphia, apparently. So I'm supposed to summarize, which I don't think I have to, because I think we've done that. Nothing else to add. Absolutely. Please remember to fill out the automatic questionnaire that you'll get very soon in your email. And I know you'll put some really fabulous comments in there. I'm just curious to know, of the 18 people that are left right now, like shout or raise your hand or whatever, if you attended live every single day of learning this week. Did anybody, Gail? Okay, anybody else? Just Gail, unless people are not, I don't see their hand. Well then Gail, you get the prize. It'll be by my front door after Shabbos. You can come and get the prize. And I can't thank Ellen and Gail enough for taking the leadership role in this fabulous week, really. Thumbs up and applause, and the best, possibly the best one of all so far. It's just so well done.